Feminism has allowed women to infiltrate our institutions, corporations, and our educational systems, which is ultimately destroying them. Beginning after 1890 and very much into the 20th century, women have had a growing place in the workforce. Feminism has spearheaded getting women into the workforce and has manipulated history to tell us that this is what all women wanted. And before women were in the workforce, all women were just oppressed and miserable and abused by their husbands. We can thank woke feminist agendas for pushing companies to enforce quotas to hire more women just to show how inclusive they are, despite the fact that the majority of sectors run by mostly women are unsuccessful. Why? Because women generally care less about profits and more about relationships. Hey, how's everyone doing? I hope we're all well. Welcome back to Debunking the Lunacy. I'm Christine Grace. Today I want to discuss some patterns and observations that have come to my attention, and after some analysis of the data I want to share some of my conclusions, and you guys can decide what you think for yourselves. I've discussed patriarchy in a previous episode and presented the observation that we no longer live in a patriarchy nor a matriarchy, but in fact we live in a gynocentric society. I guess you could say that this episode is to suggest why we would actually be better off if we went back to a patriarchy. First things first, I've got to give a special thanks to Mrs. Rachel Wilson, an astounding woman who has really opened my mind to the true history of feminism. Rachel is the author of Occult Feminism, The Secret History of Women's Liberation. She's also a wife and a homeschooling mother to 5 children. I know, right? A woman we can actually look up to. Not often that we come across one of them. And special thanks to one of the rare voices in academia that's actually willing to speak up against the leftist tyranny over academia, regardless of backlash from Marxist professors and institutions, author of The Shortest History of Our Universe and Sex, 2 Billion Years of Procreation and Recreation, Dr. David Baker. So thank you to you both for inspiring this video and helping me out with my research. So I'd like to start to present a hypothesis. Women entering the workforce leads to the detriment of businesses and poisons educational systems with socialist values that set children up for failure when they enter the real world, and leads to a world that oppresses men and treats men as second-class citizens. A prime example of women entering the workforce at the detriment of not only the company's success, but also at the detriment of freedom of speech, is Twitter. Author and PhD Dr. David Baker provides some really useful calculations to explain this very clearly. In 2014, 70% of Twitter's employees were male and 30% were female. Only 15% of its executives were female, which was considered scandalous at the time because it was lower than the 20-odd% standard for most companies. So Twitter began its woke hiring system. By 2022, 44% of Twitter's employees were female and 56% of executives were female. And by the year 2022, Twitter had one of the most diverse workforces in big tech. Twitter accomplished this not just by quotas, but by creating entirely new departments, mostly on the administrative side of things, and they funneled women into sales and marketing, where they were approximately 55% of the total staff. But in administrative roles, women formed 71.4%. This is where administrative roles include things like secretaries, HR, diversity and inclusion, to trust and safety, which collaborated with US politicians to suppress information around that particular disease that we can't name without being censored. You know, the one that dominated our whole planet back in 2020? Yeah, that one. And the 2020 election and Hunter Biden. So essentially, women dominated all of these useless departments within Twitter, while 67.1% of engineers, the people who actually run the website, were men, and only 32.9% of them were women. Meanwhile, the company was still struggling to turn a profit year on year. Funny how they had the women, the emotional creatures, running the majority of trust and safety. That couldn't possibly be because women are easier to propagate. No, that would be absurd, right? So essentially, women entered the workforce, destroying Twitter, making it less profitable, turning it into a censorious hellscape, suppressing right-wing opinions, ushering in cancel culture, and conspiring with politicians to actively deceive the public. And then, cue Elon Musk. Musk observes Twitter's censorship and the struggle to turn over a profit, and what does he do to fix this? Shock horror. A wave of layoffs. In particular, women in useless positions are hit. Dr. Baker's calculations are based on available data that's within the public sphere, providing that Twitter's gender split after the layoffs was about 64.5% men and about 35.5% women. Not quite the same as 2014 levels before all this nonsense began, but pretty close. For engineers, however, there was a slight increase to 74% being male versus only 26% being female. The result? The company is innovating again. It's making strides to become more profitable, and it is now the only big tech platform in which we have any semblance of free speech. And this is just one example of women entering the workforce at the detriment of a company's success. The rise of ultimately useless departments created around the premise of emotions rather than for profit or for strategy can be observed when we look at the HR sector. Even though most companies won't even call them HR departments anymore, they have to make up some other inclusive name that caters to everyone's feelings. They can't just call it HR. Today, roughly 75% of HR departments are female. Again, Dr. Baker observes that in 1920, only 20% of companies even had HR departments. However, the entry of women into the workforce was even more pronounced because they were covering for the men that were overseas. HR departments in World War II were brought in to handle wartime production and the flood of women into the workforce. And this was where the nightmare of modern HR departments was born. It was always a setup to facilitate women in the workforce and to make conditions friendlier to their workforce participation. In the 1950s and early 60s, HR focused more on wages and labor rights. Then, second wave feminism takes hold and HR departments start padding corners in every workplace, making things less efficient, less productive, and less innovative, and ultimately less competitive. By the 1970s, sexual harassment lawsuits take off in record numbers, and by the 1990s, gender quotas became a thing. This only intensified in the 2000s and 2010s, and academic studies claiming that more diverse workplaces have better economic results, which then encouraged companies to prioritize hiring quotas and diversity standards and practices, despite the fact that there is no credible proof that gender diversity in the workplace increases economic performance of a company. But there's plenty of evidence that indicates diversity quotas actually reduce the levels of competence and economic outcomes, all whilst being at the detriment of men, as men are policed by the women in HR on how to interact with women in the workplace, and ultimately a man has no way to interact with a woman at work without risking any kind of legal or disciplinary consequences. We can see this with the exceptional rise in false accusations made towards men on a daily basis. With the current agenda of believe all women, anything a man says or does could result in him losing his job or worse, his freedom, even with no proof of evidence to back up any of the accusations made. When we look to the educational front, it's just as bad, if not worse. Prior to the 1840s, men were overwhelmingly the majority of teachers. Then the common schools and public schools movement took hold, where education was taken out of the hands of private schools for rich kids and schools run by religious institutions, and was provided for by the government. Women flocked to primary schools because it was basically an extension of childcare. It allowed unmarried women a chance to make a living on their own, but it also allowed married women a chance to supplement their family incomes. Men didn't really flock to schools during the common schools movement because they had better paying options elsewhere. By 1860, women were the majority of primary school teachers. Secondary schools had also become dominated by women in the 70s and 80s. During this time, the curriculum became increasingly feminized. There was increasing codes of discipline that discouraged rambunctious or aggressive behavior. And by the 1990s, boys were suffering from a disadvantage in regards to how the curriculum, it was designed in a way to create passiveness in the classroom. And it's only gotten worse since then. This has had a knock-on effect, and now 60% of people who attend university are women because the system was ultimately hijacked by women to specifically be more feminine, catering to girls rather than to boys. Again, this is all at the detriment of men, and the fact that we push women into academia more, women are getting most of the degrees and therefore they're earning more, so there's not even an incentive to men to even try. And then the women will complain about the men's incompetency without acknowledging the fact that the odds are entirely in our favour. All the odds are against men. Kids aren't even prepared for the real world anymore. With the majority of teachers and school boards being made up of women, we're seeing more and more leftist values being promoted that are simply unrealistic. And they ultimately set kids up for a high fall from the pedestal of false expectations. We teach kids that there's no such thing as competition. We're seeing the rise of complete absurdities such such as participation awards. A paper published to the Sports Journal by Matthew James Williams at the University of Virginia's College, titled "Participation Trophies along with grade inflation are hurting more than helping. We have used sports to reward children with participation trophies regardless of how well they played or their contribution to the team. This change in philosophy has now moved into education, and students believe that if they show up to a class or do minimal work in the classroom, they should be rewarded with a higher grade than they deserve. This type of behaviour has created grade inflation. The idea was, if we give kids trophies, if we tell them they're wonderful, if we tell them they're special, they'll sort of develop a sense of fearlessness, and then they'll actually be more willing to do difficult things. And actually, we now have about 20 years of research that shows that's not true. This is said by Ashley Merriman, co-author of Top Dog: The Science of Winning and Losing. Grade inflation started in America during the Vietnam War. It was meant with good intentions by helping college students receive passing grades with a C or do better. Doing this would keep these college students in school and would prevent them from being drafted for the Vietnam War. They concluded that the teachers were reluctant to give students D's and F's because poor grades meant that the young men would be flunked out of school only to be drafted into the war. This is very emotional reasoning, and given that the majority of teachers would be women, it seems a fair speculation to assume that this was spearheaded by women in education. Grade inflation did not stop after the Vietnam War, but it's continued to this day and continued well into the 80s. The Washington Post editorial board argued in 2018 that it is not fair to give grades that haven't been earned, and the people who end up being cheated are the students themselves. Participation trophies and grade inflation have had a correlation in that both are used to make the child or student feel better about themselves, to eliminate failure and disappointment in life situations. But by using these two philosophies, it ultimately hurts the child more than it helps them, because real life doesn't care about your feelings. I've spoke about this before and I'll say it again. We're seeing this representation over and over of the archetype of the devouring, overbearing mother, stripping children of their competence. Women are trying to protect children from disappointment, but in doing so, they're creating the opposite effect. Whilst women have begun to contribute a larger amount of new business globally, the total revenue share of female-owned businesses has only risen from about 4 to 4.3%, meaning that whilst women are starting more businesses than ever before, they're not actually maximizing market share, nor do they take home more of the profit. 62% of women rely on their business as their sole source of income, yet 88% of those female-owned businesses will never make more than 100k. But yet feminism still sells the lie of the successful female CEO with the skyscraper office and Starbucks breaks every 10 minutes and the flashy outfits, and the only stress is deciding what to have for lunch. And the truth is, the world's nothing like that at all. These women are rare, and their lives are stressful. They haven't got time for Starbucks breaks. So how did we get here? We all know by now that we're programmed on a daily basis. It's everywhere. It's pretty self-evident. And the digital age makes it all the more easier to achieve. But how did we get to a point where for the first time in human history, the natural order of things has become so different? How did feminism hijack not only our institutions, workforce, and schools, but our whole society and even our history? Well, we could start with how history was completely rewritten from the standpoint of the oppressed woman, to make it seem as though all women were oppressed by the patriarchy throughout all of history, until one day we had enough and decided to stand up for ourselves. And there was born the suffragettes, the brave-hearted ladies who were bold enough to stand up to the man. Rachel Wilson clearly explains all of this in her book. I highly recommend you go read it because it has so much information in there, far too much for me to fit into this episode, but go check it out, and I promise if you're a girl around the same age as me, you'll be mind blown as to how much of what we're told is a complete lie, and just how dark the origins of it all is. The book explains in chapter 1 how really the genesis for feminism can be traced all the way back to early ancient religions, and feminist ideologies can be observed through goddess worship and witchcraft, tracing all the way back to ancient Hinduism, Tibetan Buddhism, ancient Egypt, Greece and Rome, as well as in Jewish mysticism and paganism, which really blew my mind because we're often told how women were just simply oppressed, and then around the time of the suffragette movement, feminism's inception began, and it all developed from there. The book details so much information all the way from ancient times right up to the suffragette march and the passing of the 19th Amendment of the American Constitution, which grants women the right to vote, for my fellow Brits if you didn't already know. And then chapter 7, titled A Brave New World, discussed this time period of when women were granted the right to vote in both the States and here in the UK. What's really interesting is that around this same time, Rachel tells us in the book how technological advancement was happening at a very fast pace at the dawn of the 20th century, making things like electricity, automobiles, movies, and air travel possible. Advancements in biology and medicine were creating questions about the ethics of using science to control fertility and reproduction. Eugenics, the idea that the biological quality of humans could be improved by using scientific technology, was front and center for the first half of the 20th century. This is also where we start to see a movement towards secular scientism and away from Christianity, blossoming into full-blown humanist and transhumanist ideas, which came to govern powerful global policy-making organizations like the United Nations and many influential non-governmental organizations, which, upon further reading, seems like less and less of a coincidence, especially when you get into chapter 9, Pandora's Box, Return to the Goddess, but I will let you go and find that for yourself. Women now earn the majority of university degrees in the United States, but they also hold the majority of university debt, which now averages at over $38,000 per borrower. This is according to the Consumer Credit Reporting Agency Experian. The top 20 careers most commonly held by women, according to the US Department of Labor, is the same type of work that they have traditionally done at home for their family, such as being a secretary, an assistant, nurse, teacher, waitress, or childcare provider. Only now they get to pay taxes and send their own kids to daycare to be raised by someone else for the privilege. Yeah, we really won there, guys. Go feminism. Thanks for that. Throughout my research for this episode and from observing the patterns that I've stated, it seems clear to me that feminism has granted women the power to infiltrate institutions, corporations, and our educational systems, which has no real benefit to anyone, men or women. Will we ever learn, or is this the beginning of the end? I like to believe that the pendulum will swing back, but with the current status quo, it does seem a small possibility. But my hopes is that through videos such as this, I can prompt a few people to dig into this stuff for themselves, and perhaps when we all take a bit of a deeper look, we might start to change things for the better. But hey, that's just what I think. Why don't you let me know what you think in the comments below? Anything you want to add that might help someone else on their journey to truth? Special thanks again to Dr. David Baker and Rachel Wilson. Please be sure to go show them both some support. The work they have both done is incredible, and they're both amazing authors. I highly recommend that you go check out their books. If you like this video, please do give it a thumbs up on your way out and subscribe to my channel for more Debunking the Lunacy episodes. If you didn't, let me know where I can improve and I'll be sure to take it on board. The purpose of this video is to present patterns and findings. You may agree, you may disagree, but either way, we can only move forward through constructive dialogue. So as always, let's try our best to remain harmonious in the adversity of opinions, and have a great week.